My name is Ahmed al-Rashid. I am 29 years old, of Syrian origin, and for 5 years I was one of the most radical anti-Christian activists in Milan's Muslim community. What happened on October 12, 2024, exactly 18 years after Carlo Acutis' death, when I deliberately invaded a commemorative mass in his honor at the Church of Santa Maria Segreta to publicly denounce Catholic idolatry in front of 300 faithful, resulted in the most transforming encounter of my life. That day, I discovered a truth about interfaith dialogue that completely changed my understanding of how God manifests through different faith traditions, revealing how a young Catholic saint can teach Muslims to love Allah more deeply than I ever imagined possible. I arrived in Italy in 2019 at 24 years old, fleeing the war in Syria after losing my entire family in a bombing that destroyed our mosque during Friday prayers. My father was a respected imam who had dedicated 30 years to teaching the Quran with gentle wisdom that attracted believers from across Damascus. My mother was a Quranic school teacher who specialized in teaching Arabic calligraphy to children, transforming each lesson into an act of worship through beauty. My 2 younger brothers, Yasin and Omar, ages 12 and 8, were my closest companions and my responsibility since our father often traveled for religious conferences. The bombing happened on March 15, 2019, at 1:17 p.m. during the Friday Jumu'ah prayers. I was at the University of Damascus defending my engineering thesis when the airstrike hit our neighborhood mosque. In 15 seconds, my entire world disappeared. My father, who was delivering the khutbah about mercy and forgiveness. My mother, who was preparing the afternoon Quranic class. My brothers, who were sitting in the front row as they always did, all killed instantly while I was discussing hydraulic engineering calculations with my professors. The tragedy left me orphaned, a refugee, and profoundly revolted against the Western world that I blamed for the Syrian conflict. In my mind, it was Western Christian nations that had supported the military interventions that destroyed my country, killed my family, and forced millions of Syrians into exile. My grief transformed into rage, and my rage found a target in Christianity itself. During my first months in Milan, living in a refugee center with 200 other displaced people from various conflicts, I developed a protective shell of anger that kept me functioning despite devastating loss. I couldn't afford to grieve properly. I needed to survive, learn Italian, find work, and somehow rebuild a life from absolute zero. But beneath the survival instinct, hatred was growing like a cancer in my soul. During my first 2 years in Milan, I discovered that refugee anger needs an outlet to avoid complete psychological collapse. I found that outlet in radical Muslim communities that channeled immigrant frustration toward religious and cultural activism. I began attending the Al-Nur Mosque, where Imam Hassan preached a harsh interpretation of Islam that perfectly matched my emotional state. "Brothers," Imam Hassan would say during Friday sermons, "we are strangers in a land that despises our faith, that considers our God false, that teaches their children that Islam is a religion of violence, while their own history is soaked with the blood of crusades and colonial oppression. We must defend our faith against this Christian invasion of our minds and hearts." These words resonated deeply with my personal pain. I started seeing Christianity not as a different religious path, but as an active enemy of everything I had lost. Every church bell that rang reminded me of Western bombs falling on Syria. Every crucifix I passed on the street represented the cultural imperialism that had destroyed my homeland. Every smiling Italian Catholic became a symbol of the privileged West that remained comfortable while my world burned. I began frequenting radical study groups where we analyzed Quranic verses about the people of the book through lenses of contemporary political anger rather than traditional scholarly interpretation. We focused on passages that could be interpreted as warnings against Christian corruption of monotheism, while ignoring verses about respectful dialogue and shared Abrahamic heritage. By 2021, I had become one of the most vocal anti-Christian activists in Milan's immigrant Muslim community. I organized street protests against Catholic symbols in public spaces, distributed literature claiming that Christianity was a Western deformation of true monotheism, and confronted missionaries who worked with refugee populations. My engineering background made me effective at creating social media campaigns that reached hundreds of young Muslims across Italy. My specialty became theological debates, where I would ambush unsuspecting Christians in public spaces, armed with Quranic verses and apologetic arguments designed to embarrass them rather than seek genuine understanding. I recorded these confrontations and posted them online with titles like "Muslim Engineer Destroys Christian Missionary with Logic" and "Syrian Refugee Exposes Catholic Idolatry." But what I didn't realize was that my anti-Christian activism was actually a displaced form of grief therapy. I was attacking Christianity because I couldn't attack the war that killed my family, couldn't fight the political forces that destroyed Syria, couldn't resurrect my father, mother, and brothers. Every argument I won against a Christian was a small victory against the helplessness that consumed me every night when I remembered the life I had lost. In 2024, something began happening in Milan's Muslim community that filled me with unprecedented alarm. Young Muslims were being seduced by the story of Carlo Acutis, the Italian teenager who had died in 2006 and been beatified in 2020. Carlo had been born in London on May 3, 1991, raised in Milan, and died of fulminant leukemia on October 12, 2006, at just 15 years old. His beatification had turned him into one of the most popular young saints of the modern era. What disturbed me most was that Carlo's story was attracting Muslim youth in ways I couldn't understand. They were fascinated by a Catholic teenager who had used computer programming to catalog Eucharistic miracles, who had maintained joy despite terminal illness, who had died with supernatural peace that impressed even non-believers. Some young Muslims in our community were even abandoning Islam to convert to Catholicism, claiming that Carlo had appeared to them in dreams and convinced them that Christianity was the true path. For our radical group, this represented spiritual warfare against our faith. We called emergency meetings to discuss the Carlo Acutis problem and develop strategies to counter what we saw as Catholic missionary infiltration disguised as youth devotion. I became obsessed with studying everything about Carlo, not from devotion but from tactical necessity. I needed to understand how Catholics were using a dead teenager to steal Muslim souls. The more I researched Carlo, the more I found aspects of his life that inexplicably resonated with Islamic values. His devotion to daily prayer reminded me of our 5 daily salat. His fasting and sacrifice echoed our practices during Ramadan. His care for the poor reflected Quranic teachings about charity. His joy in suffering paralleled stories of righteous believers I had learned from my father. This resemblance infuriated me. How dare a Catholic saint embody virtues that belong to our tradition? By October 2024, I had developed what I considered the perfect plan to embarrass the Catholic community and create viral content that would immunize Muslim youth against Carlo Acutis propaganda. I would infiltrate the commemorative Mass, marking the 18th anniversary of his death, interrupt the service with Quranic declarations about monotheism, film the shocked reaction of the faithful, and use the footage to demonstrate Catholic intolerance toward other Abrahamic faiths. I spent weeks preparing for this operation. I memorized key Quranic verses in Arabic about shirk, the sin of idolatry, practiced inflammatory speeches about Catholic worship of the dead, and recruited friends to film from multiple angles. I researched the layout of Santa Maria Segreta Church, identified the optimal moment during the Mass to create maximum disruption, and prepared escape routes in case the situation became violent. The night before the Mass, October 11, 2024, I felt the familiar excitement of impending theological warfare. I was about to strike a blow for Islamic monotheism against Catholic polytheism, to defend the honor of Allah against Christian corruption, to protect young Muslims from spiritual deception. I went to sleep believing I was preparing for holy combat in service of the one true God. The morning of October 12, 2024, I woke at 5:30 a.m. for Fajr prayers with an unusual sense of spiritual intensity. As I performed my ablutions and faced Mecca, I felt Allah's presence more strongly than I had in months. The prayers flowed with an ease and concentration that surprised me, as if my heart was being prepared for something significant beyond my planned disruption. After Fajr, I spent an hour reading Quranic verses about the people of the book, Christians and Jews, who worship the same God but through different revelations. For the first time in years, I found myself focusing on verses of respect and dialogue rather than confrontation. And you will find the nearest of them in affection to the believers, those who say, "We are Christians." The verse troubled me, because it contradicted the anger I had cultivated for 5 years. I dressed carefully for my mission, traditional Islamic clothing that would make my religious identity unmistakable, a small camera hidden in my jacket, and a Quran in Arabic that I planned to wave during my denunciation. I wanted the visual contrast to be stark, a faithful Muslim challenging Catholic idolaters in their own sacred space. The walk to Santa Maria Segreta took me through Milan's historic center, past numerous churches and Catholic symbols that had angered me for years. But that morning, something felt different. Instead of seeing enemies, I found myself noticing the beauty of the architecture, the peaceful expressions of elderly Italian women entering churches for morning prayers, the sense of devotion that radiated from these sacred spaces. I arrived at Santa Maria Segreta at 10:15 a.m., 15 minutes before the commemorative Mass was scheduled to begin. The church was already filling with families, young people, elderly faithful, approximately 300 people gathering to honor the memory of a teenager they considered blessed. I positioned myself in a middle pew, close enough to the altar to ensure maximum disruption, but with clear access to exits if the situation became dangerous. As people continued entering, I observed their faces carefully, expecting to see the arrogance and spiritual pride that I had convinced myself characterized Catholic believers. Instead, I saw genuine devotion, families praying together, young people with the same earnest spirituality I remembered from my mosque in Damascus before the war destroyed everything. During the opening hymn, sung in Italian with simple beauty that reminded me of Islamic nasheeds, I felt an unexpected emotion. These people loved God. Their devotion was directed differently than mine, expressed through different traditions, but the underlying love for the divine was unmistakable. For a moment, my certainty wavered. Was I about to attack fellow believers rather than idolaters? When Father Marco began the homily about Carlo's life and intercession, I forced myself to focus on the theological differences that justified my mission. Catholics ask saints to intercede for them, which seemed too similar to praying to beings other than Allah. They venerate relics and images, which appeared to violate strict monotheism. They believe in the Trinity, which contradicted the absolute unity of God that my father had taught me. But as the priest spoke about Carlo's joy and suffering, his love for the Eucharist, his devotion to daily prayer, his care for those less fortunate, I heard echoes of Islamic spirituality. This Catholic teenager had lived according to principles that any imam would recognize as righteous. How could someone following false doctrine produce such obviously virtuous fruit? At 10:45 a.m., Father Marco reached the part of his homily where he described how Carlo continued to intercede for people around the world, bringing healing and conversion through his prayers in heaven. This was my planned moment to interrupt, when he made the clearest claims about a created being having divine power. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding with adrenaline and righteous anger. The moment had come to defend Islamic monotheism against Catholic corruption, to protect young Muslims from spiritual deception, to strike a blow for the honor of Allah against those who associated partners with him. La ilaha illa Allah, I shouted in Arabic at the top of my voice, my words echoing through the suddenly silent church. There is no God but Allah. You Catholics commit shirk by worshipping the dead instead of the one true God. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me in shock. Some children began crying. Elderly worshippers looked confused and frightened. Young people pulled out phones to record what was happening. Father Marco stopped mid-sentence, clearly unsure how to respond to this unprecedented interruption. I continued my planned denunciation, pulling out my Quran and waving it above my head. Carlo Acutis was just a dead boy. Stop worshipping corpses and submit to the true God. Your Trinity is shirk. Your saints are shirk. Only Allah deserves worship. Several men began moving toward me, their faces showing anger at my desecration of their sacred space. A woman near me was crying as she clutched her rosary. The peaceful atmosphere of worship had been shattered by my theological aggression, exactly as I had planned. I was filming everything with my concealed camera, capturing the dismay and confusion of Catholic believers confronted with Islamic truth. This footage would become viral content proving that Christians couldn't handle honest theological challenge, that their faith crumbled when confronted with pure monotheism. But then something extraordinary happened that changed the entire trajectory of my life, my faith, and my understanding of how God works in the world. I felt a peaceful presence beside me, not threatening or confrontational, but calm and gentle in a way that seemed impossible given the chaos I had just created. I turned and saw a young man of approximately 15 years old, wearing modern sneakers, jeans, and a t-shirt with the phrase, "Towards Sainthood," written in perfect Arabic calligraphy, something impossible, since this was a specifically Catholic expression perfectly translated into our sacred language. The young man's presence radiated a peace that seemed to slow down time itself. The angry voices of approaching Catholics faded to whispers. The crying children became quiet. Even my own heart, which had been racing with confrontational adrenaline, began to calm in a way I couldn't explain. "Assalamu alaikum, Ahmed," he said in fluent Arabic, using our traditional Islamic greeting with perfect pronunciation and cultural sensitivity. "Wa alaikumus salamu," I responded automatically, the response trained into me since childhood. Then the impossibility of the situation hit me. "Who are you? How do you know Arabic? How do you know my name?" The young man smiled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his apparent age. "My name is Carlo Acutis. During my earthly life, I catalogued Eucharistic miracles through computer programming because I believed that Allah, whom you call by this beautiful name, is the same God of Abraham that we worship through different paths." I staggered backward, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. You're Christian. You can't use the sacred name of Allah. You don't believe in the true God." Carlo's expression remained peaceful, but his eyes showed a depth of understanding that unnerved me. "Ahmed, Allah has 99 beautiful names, and one of them is Ar-Rahim, the most merciful. The mercy of Allah is not limited to one specific religion. I came here because you are attacking people who also love God sincerely, even if they express that love differently than you do. But you commit shirk," I insisted, falling back on the theological arguments I had prepared. "You worship Jesus as God. You pray to saints. You believe in Trinity. All violations of Tawhid, the absolute unity of Allah." Carlo stepped closer, and I noticed that his presence seemed to create a bubble of peace around us. The angry Catholics had stopped advancing. The entire church had fallen into an expectant silence, as if everyone was witnessing something beyond normal experience. "Ahmed," Carlo said gently, "your revolt is not against our faith. It's against the pain of losing your family. You blame Christianity for the war that killed your father, mother, and brothers. But war does not represent true Christianity, just as terrorism does not represent true Islam." His words hit me like physical blows. How could this impossible figure know about my family? How could he understand the source of my anger better than I understood it myself? Carlo touched my shoulder with a gentleness that reminded me of my father's hand during childhood prayers. "Brother, you have carried this pain for 5 years, transforming your grief into hatred because hatred feels more powerful than helplessness. But Allah did not send you to Milan to hate Christians. He sent you here to learn that His mercy transcends the boundaries humans create." Tears began flowing down my face without my permission. For 5 years I had successfully suppressed my grief through anger and activism, but this young man's words were breaking through defenses I had built to protect myself from the devastating reality of loss. "You don't understand," I whispered. "They destroyed everything. My father, who taught the Quran with love, my mother who made every day beautiful, my brothers who looked up to me, all gone because of Western wars supported by Christian nations. How can I not hate?" Carlo's eyes filled with compassion that seemed infinite. "Ahmed, I died of leukemia when I was your brother's age. I understand loss, even though mine was different from yours. But I learned something about suffering that I want to share with you. Pain that turns into hatred destroys the person carrying it, but pain that turns into love has power to heal the world." "What love?" I asked bitterly. "What healing? My family is dead. My country is destroyed. My life is exile among people who consider my faith false." Carlo smiled with a joy that seemed impossible, given the seriousness of our conversation. "Ahmed, tomorrow you will receive news that your cousin Fatima, who lives in Damascus, is dying of cancer, the same leukemia that took my life. She will need desperate financial help for treatment that could save her. When that happens, observe carefully who offers to help you save her life." I stared at him in shock. "How can you know about something that hasn't happened yet? How can you know about Fatima when I've never spoken of her to anyone in Milan?" "Because Allah allows me to see the future when it's necessary to heal wounded hearts," Carlo replied with complete certainty. "Ahmed, tomorrow you will discover that Christians and Muslims can be brothers when facing genuine human suffering. and you will begin to understand that the God you serve and the God we serve is the same merciful Father who loves all his children. The church around us remained in supernatural silence. I could see people watching our conversation with amazement, but no one approached or interrupted. It was as if invisible forces were protecting this impossible encounter from external interference. Carlo continued, "Brother, your father was a man of God, who taught mercy and forgiveness. Your mother was a woman of faith who found the divine in beauty and learning. Your brothers were innocent souls who knew only love before they met Allah face to face. Do you think they would want you to spend your life hating in their memory, or would they want you to honor them by showing the mercy they taught you?" Before I could respond to Carlo's challenge about my family's wishes, he did something that shattered every theological argument I had prepared over 5 years of anti-Christian activism. He began reciting, in perfect classical Arabic, verses from the Quran that I had never heard used to build bridges rather than walls. "O people of the Scripture, come to a word that is equitable between us and you, that we will not worship except Allah, and not associate anything with him, and not take one another as lords instead of Allah." His pronunciation was flawless, his understanding evident, his respect for our sacred text absolute. I stood frozen, watching a Catholic saint quote the Quran with more reverence than many Muslims I knew. Everything I had believed about Christianity being inherently opposed to Islam began crumbling. Carlo continued, "Ahmed, your father taught you that Allah is Al-Wadud, the loving one. Do you think divine love stops at religious boundaries drawn by human interpretation? Do you think the mercy that encompasses all things cannot reach Christian hearts that sincerely seek God through the tradition they inherited?" "But the Trinity," I stammered, grasping for familiar arguments, "is their way of understanding divine mystery." Carlo replied gently, "Just as your beautiful concept of Tawheed is your way of understanding the same mystery. Allah is infinite, Ahmed. Human minds can only grasp fragments of his reality. Christians emphasizing God's relationship within himself, Muslims emphasizing his absolute unity, both truths pointing toward the same incomprehensible divine reality." I felt my worldview shifting beneath my feet like an earthquake. "You're saying our religions aren't enemies?" Carlo's smile was radiant. "I'm saying that any path that leads people to love Allah more deeply, to serve others more generously, to seek truth more humbly, that path has Allah's blessing, regardless of its external form. Your father knew this. In his heart, he probably respected genuine Christian faith, even while disagreeing with some Christian interpretations." The memory hit me with stunning clarity. My father had indeed spoken respectfully about Christian neighbors in Damascus, had worked with Christian doctors in refugee assistance, had taught me that people of sincere faith recognize each other across traditions. I had forgotten these lessons in my grief and anger. "Tomorrow," Carlo continued, "when you receive the call about Fatima, you will have a choice. You can remain imprisoned in hatred and try to save her alone, or you can open your heart to the Christians who will offer help. Allah is sending you this test to show you something about his mercy that you've forgotten." At that moment, the supernatural silence in the church was broken by Father Marco's voice. "My friends, I don't know what we are witnessing, but I feel the presence of the Holy Spirit in a way I've rarely experienced. Let us pray for our Muslim brother who has honored us with his passionate faith, even in disagreement." 300 Catholics began praying silently, not against me, but for me. I could feel their intentions like warmth surrounding my heart. These people I had come to attack were interceding for my well-being with genuine love. Carlo placed both hands on my shoulders. "Ahmed, this is how Allah works in the world. Through unexpected kindness, through bridges built where walls once stood, through hearts that choose love over hatred, despite having every human reason for anger. Your family's deaths were a tragedy, but your life can become their memorial through mercy rather than revenge." The next morning, October 13th, 2024, I woke to my phone ringing at 6:17 a.m. The call was from my Aunt Zara in Damascus, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "Ahmed, it's Fatima. Yesterday she collapsed at university. The doctors, they say it's leukemia, advanced stage. She needs treatment that costs 15,000 euros and we have nothing. Nothing, Ahmed. If we can't get help in the next few weeks." I sat in stunned silence, remembering Carlo's impossible prophecy. Fatima was my 19-year-old cousin, the daughter of my father's brother, the only close family member who had survived the war. She had been accepted to study medicine at Damascus University despite the ongoing conflict. A brilliant young woman who represented hope for our family's future. "Kalti Zara," I said to my aunt, "I'll find the money somehow. Don't lose hope." But after the call ended, I sat in my small refugee apartment, calculating impossibilities. I earned barely enough to support myself through part-time engineering work. My refugee status limited my employment options. Saving 15,000 euros would take years I didn't have. Fatima would die of the same disease that had killed Carlo Acutis, while I, who had denounced his faith, remained powerless to help. I spent the day desperately calling Islamic organizations, refugee assistance programs, and Muslim charities throughout Italy. Everyone expressed sympathy, but the amounts offered were minimal. 50 euros here, 100 euros there. By evening I had raised less than 300 euros toward the 15,000 needed. That night, as I sat in despair thinking about losing the last member of my immediate family, someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened it to find Father Marco from Santa Maria Segreta, accompanied by 3 parishioners I recognized from the Mass I had disrupted. "Ahmed," Father Marco said gently, "we heard through our refugee assistance network about your cousin's situation. We want to help." One of the parishioners, an elderly Italian woman named Signora Benedetti, stepped forward. "My grandson died of leukemia 3 years ago. I know what your family is facing. No one should lose a child to that disease when treatment is available." Over the next hour, they explained that Santa Maria Segreta Parish had organized an emergency collection during their evening masses over the past 2 days. Word had spread through Milan's Catholic community about the Syrian refugee whose cousin needed leukemia treatment, the same disease that had taken their beloved Carlo Acutis. "We've raised 18,000 euros, Father Marco announced, handing me an envelope. "Enough for Fatima's treatment plus extra for additional care she might need." I stared at the envelope, unable to process what was happening. These were the same Catholics I had attacked and humiliated just 2 days earlier. I had called their faith false, interrupted their sacred worship, accused them of idolatry, yet they were saving my cousin's life. "Why?" I whispered. "After what I did to you, why would you help me?" Signora Benedetti smiled through tears. "Because Carlo Acutis taught us that love has no religious boundaries. Your cousin needs help, and we serve the same merciful God that you serve. That's all that matters." Today, 8 months later, Fatima is in complete remission. Her leukemia treatment was successful, and she's returned to her medical studies with renewed purpose. She wants to become a pediatric oncologist to help other children with the disease that nearly killed her. But more importantly, for my own spiritual journey, I have been transformed by an encounter that I can only call miraculous. I remain a practicing Muslim. I still perform my 5 daily prayers, fast during Ramadan, and hold firmly to Islamic monotheism. But I no longer see Christianity as an enemy to be defeated. Instead, I now lead interfaith dialogue initiatives between Milan's Muslim and Catholic communities. We visit hospitals together, assist refugees regardless of their religion, and organize peace events that demonstrate how Christians and Muslims can collaborate respectfully while maintaining their distinct traditions. I've learned that Catholics don't worship saints like Carlo Acutis. They ask for intercession, similar to how we seek dua, prayers, from righteous people in Islamic tradition. I've discovered that their devotion to the Eucharist reflects the same reverence for the sacred that we show toward the Quran. I've found that their emphasis on divine mercy echoes our constant invocation of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Most profoundly, I've realized that my 5 years of anti-Christian hatred were not defending Allah's honor. They were defending my own wounded ego against a world that had taken everything I loved. True defense of Allah's honor comes through demonstrating the mercy and compassion that are his most prominent attributes. Carlo Acutis taught me that God is too great to be limited by our human divisions. Just as he catalogued Eucharistic miracles through his passion for computer programming, he continues to catalogue miracles of unity between people who worship the same God through different paths that complement rather than contradict each other. The young man who invaded a Catholic mass to attack idolaters discovered that sometimes the greatest jihad, the struggle in the path of God, is not against external enemies, but against the hatred in our own hearts that prevents us from recognizing fellow believers across traditional boundaries. If you have ever felt that your pain justifies hatred toward others, if you have ever believed that defending your faith requires attacking other faiths, if you have ever thought that God's love is limited to those who worship exactly as you do, I invite you to consider that Allah's mercy is truly wasi'at kulli shay. It encompasses all things. And sometimes, that mercy comes through unexpected messengers who speak our language, know our hearts, and show us that the God we seek to serve is already working in ways more beautiful than our limited understanding can grasp. Carlo Acutis whispered to me that Allah and the Father of Jesus are the same God of Abraham, calling his children home through paths of love rather than roads of hatred. And in a world torn by religious conflict, that whisper might just be the beginning of the peace we all claim to seek in our prayers. Allahu A'lam. God knows best.